Political parties are organized institutions that seek to nominate candidates and try to influence public policy by gaining control of the government. This is in contrast to interest groups that simply operate outside the governmental structure. As parties seek to elect their persons to be in office, they have to integrate interests. They have to reach across a broader spectrum than do simply interest groups. They serve to simplify voter choices, and they complement the legally established process of choosing public officials. And they are a very important training ground for people who would be political leaders. When they're in government, they have to organize the government and give coherence to government policy and help make the government responsible to the people. Now, there's a significant difference between European and American political parties. European political parties have a closed membership, generally charge dues, and create duties for their members. American parties are one on self-identification. You can pay dues if you want to, and you can be a part of the machinery if you want to. The nominations in a European political party are very definitely controlled by the leadership of the party, whereas in the United States, direct primaries and caucuses essentially choose the delegates and help choose the candidates. Now, in return, European parties control the office holders rather than the other way around. In American parties, the office holders largely control and dominate the party leadership. Now, let's talk a little bit about the history of American political parties, and there are eras that define political parties. Wars, the period between wars and during wars, economic depressions or turmoil, and last but not least, generational change plays a significant role. Now, the book has a fairly good explanation of this. I'm sure that you probably did it in your History 1301. In the very formative period, the Federalist and the Jeffersonian Republicans, known as the Democratic Republican Party, dominated. When the Federalist Party deteriorated, the Democratic Republican Party, which was there from 1816 to 1828, sometimes called the era of good feelings, though when you go back and look at the history, it's not real clear that the feelings were that good. The Jacksonian Democrats emerged, and you returned to partisan politics. The National Republican Party, also known as the Whigs, were a major force during this period. The Whigs basically began to deteriorate and completely fell apart in 1856, and the Republican Party, the National Republican Party, the existing Republican Party, took its place. During the period of Civil War and Reconstruction, the Republican Party was the dominant political party, and that gave rise to machine politics, where urban machine bosses largely tended to control the parties. 1896 to 1932 was an interesting period. A reform era, World War I, and the return after World War I to normalcy. The major contenders were the Republicans, the Democrats, and the Populist Party. When the Depression began in 1928 in earnest, for a brief period of time, the Republican Party managed to have some control. In the elections of 1930, the Democrats took charge of Congress, and in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected. We call the period from 1932 to 1968 the New Deal era. I'm not sure those dates really fit that well, but I'm not in charge of that. The modern era began in 1968 with the election of Richard Nixon, and if we had the time, we could go into this in a great deal more time. Political machines basically tended to dominate politics between the 1880s and the 1940-50s, largely local, state-based, both in the Democratic and Republican Party. They used patronage, government contracts, and the caucus convention system of nominating candidates to control. Some of the reforms that knocked a hole in the machines were the rise of civil service, modern welfare system which took the place of parties providing the welfare, the advent of primary elections and the use of secret ballots, and the requirement that there be competitive contracts for government services rather than it simply being handed down by the political bosses. Now, when we study political parties, we look at them as organizations, we look at them as their role in government, and we look at the role in the electorate. As organizations, the charts can get kind of complicated. You have the national committees, you have congressional campaign committees, you have Senate campaign committees, you have state executive committees, you have local committees. It can be confusing, and then there are all sorts of informal organizations. If you'll look at the notes, you'll see that there are several parties in the United States. And if you have a little time, click on the third party link. It will surprise you how many minor parties there are in the United States. The congressional campaign committees, particularly the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, one for the House Minority Leader. At the present time, the Democrats are in the minority. The Senate Campaign Committee and the Democratic Governors Association. The Republicans have the National Campaign Committee, the speakers, the Republican conferences, the Republican senatorial, the Republican Senate leader, and the Republican Governors Conference. When we look at Texas, we have 3 parties, and they each have websites. You might look at those. When we look at the presidential nominating process, it's a kind of an interesting mess. In 13 states, caucuses choose the delegates. In the other 37 states, we have direct primaries, and they can be either winner-take-all or proportional representation. The primaries can be open to anyone who chooses to participate, or can be closed, meaning only that those who have identified themselves as a party member in advance of the primary can participate. When we talk about party identification, we call it a psychological orientation, a long-term propensity to think positively of and vote regularly for a political party. We talked a little bit about that as a schema. A person who has a personal identification with and votes for its candidate is generally what we call party identification. And here is a chart. If you have time to study it, Gallup poll has looked at the percentage conservative, percentage moderate, percentage liberal, but I warn you, these figures are somewhat misleading because people have different concepts of what constitutes conservative, moderate, and liberal. When we look at party identification, obviously more Republicans identify themselves as conservatives and more liberals identify themselves as Democrats. But notice that the difference between moderate Republicans, when you add it up, moderate Republicans plus conservative Republicans are all but 5% of the total. The Democrats, on the other hand, you have almost 80+% of the Democrats identify themselves as either moderates or liberals. And this chart, party identification, kind of play with it. It's sort of interesting, but notice that the percentage of people who identify themselves as either Democrats or Republicans has declined since basically the mid-'80s. Ideology trends by party. The Republican Party has become more conservative. Now, I'm not going to walk you through each and every one of these charts because it takes a lot of time. Just take your time and look at them if you will.